Okay, so first thing is just taking a look at the talents. I'm just gonna go through each one and explain like why each one got picked and what the other options are in each tier. So for 56, you have these three. Typically, the best two are Bursting Sores or Ebon Fever. Ebon Fever is really good on stuff like Il'gynoth, where things are gonna die quicker than you have your disease just doing better damage on all the ads. Bursting Sores makes your wounds do 50% more damage, but it also makes them do a little bit of cleave. That can be good on. It's just. I mean, I pick it for PvP mostly, but it's also good on stuff like dragons where you have those small ads that show up every once in a while. It allows you, instead of having to focus on them, you can cleave them down a little bit. Um, all will serve typically don't really see. It gives you an extra little ghoul that shoots a bow. Um, its damage just isn't as good as the other ones. It can be useful if you're having a lot of trouble keeping up damage because you're moving out of stuff too much. But generally, you want either Ebon Fever or Bursting Sores. It kind of comes down to preference. Ebon Fever, I used it initially, um, but on single target stuff like Ursoc and things like that, I found that I spent a lot of time refreshing my disease. I mean, it makes your disease last half as long but do the same damage, so you're just going to be applying your disease way more often. Um, both of these, I believe, are about equal, but Ebon Fever is really good on fights with a lot of ads that die fairly quickly. Again, like Il'gynoth, something like that. Um, the 57 talent tier, Epidemic is really good for AoE fights, um, but it's for good burst AoE, and that's kind of it. You don't ever really use it on any single target or anything like that. Blighted Rune Weapon applies more festering wounds every minute. The numbers on this just aren't, like, it's just not worth it. Pestilent Pustules, it doesn't affect your rotation at all. Like, Epidemic is an activated ability, you have to choose to use it. Pestilent Pustules doesn't affect your rotation in any way. At just every 6 wounds you burst, you get a rune that just lets you do more stuff every so often. It plays really well when you use Apocalypse, you pretty much get a free rune back, assuming that you're popping 6 or more wounds, obviously. In the next tier, Unholy Frenzy is bad. That's kind of it. It's bad. It doesn't have any. It's undertuned. Castigator, technically speaking, outperforms Clawing Shadows, but only if you start stacking crit. Running Castigator requires you to not want haste and mastery as much as you want crit. Um, I don't like crit classes. That's just why I don't pick it. On top of that, the utility of Clawing Shadows, making it ranged, is really nice. For example, on Nithendra, Heart of the Swarm comes in. I put up 8 wounds, and then I'll back off because I can keep popping those wounds from range while I'm dancing around the bugs and the poison. If you're running Clawing Shadows, Haste and Mastery are your top. If you're running Castigator, I believe it's Haste and Crit. The next tier, you always pick Sludge Belcher for PvE. The other two are PvP only. Don't ever worry about those if you're just doing PvE. This one is utility, survival, lingering apparition isn't good. Spell Eater is the standard pick. Corpse Shield. So the thing between the two, Spell Eaters, you don't have to worry about it as much. It just makes your anti-magic shell better. Corpse Shield is another defensive on top of what you have, but the thing with it is you really only I mean, you're going to have Sludge Belcher, but this is only good with Sludge Belcher to begin with. The reason being, even with your Ghoul, you have to use it in combination with your pet's ability, which is a defensive. So if I use Corpse Shield during like Nithendra or something because I'm getting hit by a bug, my Ghoul's gonna die in like 3 seconds, and then I'm gonna be without him for 30 seconds. Because if your pet dies while you're using it, it can't be resummoned for another 30 seconds. So you lose out on DPS if you misuse it. You use it in combination with Protective Bile because that will reduce the damage that your pet is taking while it's soaking 90% of your damage. The easier choice is just Spell Eater. This can be more useful because Anti-Magic Shell won't help you from physical attacks, and this will. But, I mean, it's personal preference, and Spell Eater is the easier, more convenient choice. It requires less to think about. In the next tier, I'm not sure about the numbers on these two. From what I remember, they're just not tuned well enough. The chance on this, it doesn't proc enough for it to be worth it. I mean, you're making your own wounds plenty often. This isn't really good because of the way you use Death Coil. You tend to spam it back to back versus Death Coil, Scourge Strike, Death Coil, Scourge Strike, which is how this would want you to use it. I think this can be good, but you have to really tune your rotation to it. Shadow Infusion just rewards you for using Death Coil, which you should already be doing by making your transformation have higher uptime. Now, the last tier is really subjective. Defile's only good for AoE, like AoE heavy stuff. You don't really pick that ever, but a lot of people argue between Arbiter and Soul Reaper. I think Arbiter is a higher DPS single target increase, but you have to be smart about how you use it, because it gains that damage from you using runic power, which would primarily should be from Death Coil, not from Death Strike. Soul Reaper hits pretty hard, but it also gives you haste when you use it. So the way Soul Reaper works, let me just demonstrate it real quick. So if I use Festering Strike, I've got 5 wounds. You can see them here. The optimal way to use Soul Reaper is you need 3 or more wounds, because once you put Soul Reaper on them, the buff only stays on them for a little bit, and you want to pop 3 wounds within that buff. Every wound you pop will give you 7% haste here, and that's about it. It pairs really well with Apocalypse, because if you build up, say, 8 wounds, and then you Soul Reaper and instantly Apocalypse, it'll give you those 3 wounds immediately. It's got a 45-second cooldown, which lets you use it on Apocalypse, and then halfway between your next Apocalypse. That's why I like it. I like the haste that it gives you, and I also like that it synergizes really well with the artifact ability itself. I haven't used Dark Arbiter. There's more information out there. I just don't like it. I believe they're pretty comparable. That's why the debate's so strong. I think it comes down to personal preference. So one thing to note about Soul Reaper is, like, say I have my wounds up, and I use Soul Reaper. If I'm not popping any wounds, say I spam Death Coil instead. If I'm not popping any wounds, I don't get any haste. When you use Soul Reaper, you have to be ready to pop 3 or more, up to 3 wounds, because it only stacks to 3, but you have to activate it. You put the Soul Reaper on him, and then you pop 3 wounds. If you're not doing that, you're not going to get any benefit from it. You're just kind of going to spend a rune, deal some damage, but not get any lasting benefit. If you're having trouble using it, then it might be better to just use Arbiter, if that's something you're more used to. Now, there was a question about why you use Death Coil so often. So Death Strike obviously does minor damage and then heals you for 10% of your health. A little bit more if you've taken excessive damage. The problem is, so Death Strike does, technically speaking, more damage here on the tooltip. 92k physical versus 37k shadow. And then if you compare Death Coil to Clawing Shadows, it also does less shadow damage than Clawing Shadows baseline. But the thing about Death Coil is it's going to give energy to your pet, which lets it do its damaging ability more often. And the main reason you use Death Coil is it'll trigger this proc. Doesn't always happen, but you use it so much because this will double how quickly your runes come back. And if you have more runes up, that means you're putting up more Festering Strikes, or you're putting up more Clawing Shadows. More runes means more wounds, basically, and wounds are the core of the damage that we do. So, with that out of the way, just going to beat up this dummy so you can have an idea of the abilities that I use, kind of how I use them. I'll do just like a basic rotation, and then I'll show my cooldowns to kind of just show what the DPS is. So always open with Dark Transformation and Outbreak. I use my, so like here, I'm gonna slow it down a little bit. I used my festering strikes to build up wounds. Both of them gave me 3, and then I instantly started doing death coil. At the time, I mean, it's hard to slow it down because I'm not voicing over this. I'm talking as I do it. The reason I do that, so like say I used all 3 of my festering strikes, is now I have no wounds. So I'm going to fill the space with my death coils until I have time to pop. And then, so like checking this, just because my thing is out, now that I have 8 wounds up, instead of festering striking, I'm going to use clawing shadows pretty much until I'm down to 0. And like, again, down here, if you need runes, that's when you fill the space with your death coil. So a lot of the rotation, you'll find yourself doing like festering wounds back to back, and then you'll be doing lots of death coils, and then lots of scourge strikes. Typically, your abilities kind of come in droves. The way I do the rotation is I stack up pretty much 6 or more wounds, and then I pop them. Another way you can do it that might be a little bit more balanced, if you don't like that, is just use 1 festering strike and then pop whatever wounds you got, and then that can feel more like a rotation. But the thing is, you have to be wary of how many wounds your festering strike creates. Like the last 2 gave me 2 wounds each, but this one gave me 4. So I have to make sure to pop all of those if that's what I'm going to do. And then say, it's like pretending this is Nathendra, say I know Heart of the Swarm's coming, so I'll build up as many wounds as I can before it's time to leave. And then I'll run away, and I can still clawing shadows him from range and pop those wounds. Like you can still see them going down. And you can still use death coil as well. And my ghoul's on passive. That shouldn't have been that way. And then you have your Apocalypse ability, which you should pretty much like Dark Transformation, Soul Reaper, Apocalypse you should be using on cooldown. Apocalypse, the way I do it with Soul Reaper is I'll just build up, I want 7 to 8, but 6 if I'm having really bad luck with how many wounds I'm getting. Once you build up that many wounds, you just Soul Reaper and then use Apocalypse. And for some reason that didn't give me the haste buff, but it gave me the ghouls. Alright, so let me go reset in combat. And then I'll just do the rotation without Army of the Dead or Gargoyle, just to show what it looks like, and then I'll do it with Army of the Dead and Gargoyle to show roughly how much damage that puts out. Army of the Dead gives you a huge damage boost. Gargoyle, Arbiter are just kind of part of your rotation. It's a minor offensive cooldown compared to the 10-minute one, but you want to use it on cooldown. The way with Arbiter, so like Gargoyle, I can just fire and forget. That's it. I just press it when it's up. Arbiter, you want to build up your runic power first, so that when you summon it, you can dump in as much runic power as possible, since that'll increase its damage. Alright, now let's go back. I'll have my ghoul actually do damage this time. And so like sometimes Soul Reaper and Apocalypse haven't perfectly lined up, maybe because you were holding on to Soul Reaper to make sure you had those wounds and the runes. It's okay, just sometimes you have to adjust. There's a lot about the Unholy rotation in quotes. That's not necessarily a rotation. For us, it's more about prioritizing certain abilities, and it does center around our festering wounds. And so like here, I'm getting really bad luck. My wounds are my festering strikes were only giving me 2 wounds per pop. And that's the worst. Obviously, the best case scenario is for each festering strike to just give you 4. That means you can have an easier time keeping up your damage. And the more time you're popping wounds, the better. And so like now Apocalypse is coming back up, so that's basically our entire rotation's on a 1.5 minute cooldown because it's based like Apocalypse pretty much means you're using it. If you're using it when it's up, one Apocalypse go around is pretty much how much damage you'll sustain. So I mean it's going down now because it's still counting me in combat, but I was doing about 210,000 sustained, over 200,000. And of course, this is just a tank and spank dummy that doesn't take into account how much I'm moving, how much I would run around in a real fight. Again, that's why Clawing Shadows is really nice. Those times that you do have to move around, that you're out of melee range, if you have wounds up, you can still pop them with Clawing Shadows from range. If you're using Castigator, that utility kind of goes away, but you just have to be more careful about what you're doing. And if you're using Castigator, you kind of want to be in melee range all the time as much as possible, versus Clawing Shadows, you have a little bit more flexibility on your movement within the raid. So now I'll just real quick show off kind of burst damage using all the cooldowns. So show you what that looks like. So like opening pull, you see I don't have DBM. I'm always like a little bit behind for you guys because I don't see the like 10-second pull or anything like that. But I always start Ghoul, Army, Gargoyle, Outbreak, first Festering Strike, and then I can use Death Coil to try to get it back, get my runes back. Alright, so now I got 8 wounds. I'm going to Soul Reaper, and I'm going to Apocalypse, and then I'm going to settle into the rest of my rotation. That was the opening burst. Now it's just settling into everything like normal. And you will sometimes get, just depending on how your things go, time where you're just waiting for a few seconds. I think the reason some people will not build up to 8 wounds and pop them all is to kind of try to avoid that. Just out of personal experience, I've had better luck building up a lot of wounds and then dumping Scourge Strikes to pop them all. And then after that, applying wounds and dumping Runic Power to get my runes back, etc. When you use Soul Reaper, you should always be following it up with Clawing Shadows or Scourge Strike. If you're using Soul Reaper, it means you're intending to pop wounds in the next couple of seconds. Don't use Soul Reaper if you have no wounds on the target. Only use it if you already have 3 or more wounds and you are intending to pop them. Alright, and then so Apocalypse is back. So you see, pretty much same thing. I didn't get Hero, which is something that will affect your burst. That's just what the beginning of a fight would look like. Why is my Ghoul on passive again? Oh, I keep forgetting to turn him back on after I come over here and reset. So one more thing to take into consideration is your trees. We're kind of at the point that you probably already have 2 gold traits, but if for some reason you're still deciding on which ones you want first, you want the Shambler and Scourge of Worlds first. Shambler just attacks randomly, have a chance to spawn something that explodes for shadow damage. I see it proc pretty often, so it's really good. Scourge of Worlds doesn't affect your rotation either. You'll see the debuff. I'll go get it in a little bit. Death Coil. So again, Death Coil is your main filler ability. You're just using that when you're either trying to get runes back up, or you have nothing else to do, or if you're capped up on runic power. This makes it so your Death Coil has a chance to increase how much your Scourge Strike does, which is just a nice little damage thing. So if I build up some runic power here, and it can trigger from the free Death Coils from Sudden Doom. So like there, it activated. It lasts for 5 to 6 seconds, I think, and just any Scourge Strikes I use during that will do baseline their base damage more damage. It doesn't affect how much the wound popping does. It affects how much the initial hit is. So instead of doing 92,000, it would do like 120,000, for instance. When you're coming up here, so I have this one instead of, I could have had my double doom instead, my third gold trait. I got this because I do PvP. You want this instead. Don't, like, this is basically useless in PvE. The least wanted abilities are pretty much runic tattoos. That's kind of one of the last ones because it doesn't really do much for you. Everything else that increases the damage and ability is pretty well useful. Scourge the Unbeliever is a very important non-gold trait. Scourge Strike has a 10% chance to generate 1 rune. That's very useful. When it procs, it just means you get your rune back, and that means either more popping of wounds with Scourge Strike or setting up more wounds with your Festering Strike. So take a quick look at AoE. It's pretty simple. It revolves around Death and Decay. So if you have your Abomination, empowering him makes him do AoE by default. If I come over here, I'm setting up, so like AoE, you just pick one target who's going to have the most health because you want him to survive the longest. Because when something dies, your wounds go away with it. Just put as many wounds as you can on a target. If you have it, you can use Apocalypse. That'll do some, with bursting wounds, or bursting swords, I think, that'll do some cleave damage to everything. You build up 8 wounds, you drop Death and Decay, and then you just pop all the wounds on your target. When you're standing in your Death and Decay, Scourge Strike hits everything next to the target you're looking at. That'll just do extra damage. So say you got a really nice haste proc, or if there's a lot of enemies, say like 10 or more, that Scourge the Unbeliever standing in Death Strike will make your Scourge Strike or Clawing Shadows hit all targets near your target. When you're hitting that many mobs at once, you're pretty much always going to have whatever rune you just spent instantly refunded. So if you're hitting a lot of smaller enemies and you have those 8 wounds, it's not going to really cost you any runes here. If you've popped all the wounds but your Death and Decay is still up, just keep spamming Clawing Shadows until it goes away. Once it goes away, then you want to start kind of setting your wounds back up. So going back over this, the Bursting Swords does help a little bit with AoE because it gives, whenever you pop a wound, it gives you a little bit of cleave damage, which is really nice. But again, Ebon Fever is also good because it basically doubles the damage of your disease by reducing the time it takes for it to tick. This is really good on like trash. This is good for dungeons especially. It's kind of hard to pick. Bursting Swords for that cleave AoE versus this is really good on targets that you know won't live the full. I don't have it, so it lasts 21 seconds. That means your disease would do its full damage in 10 to 11 seconds, and that's it. It's really just up to you. The reason I pick Bursting Swords is I like the cleave. It helps with AoE damage a little bit more. Stuff like Il'gynoth on the dragons, getting those spirits down. And then also because I PvP, that the wounds dealing 50% more damage means in PvP I do more burst damage, which is really important. And that's pretty much it.